Hello and welcome to another episode of the 1020 podcast. Today I'll be talking to no other than Yoram Hazony. Dr. Hazony has emerged as one of the major figures in a new modern form of conservatism, starting with his first major publication on the question of nationalism titled The Virtue of Nationalism in 2018, a brave book that defended the cultural, historical and religious roots of nationalism. He is now back on the scene with another book titled Conservatism, a Rediscovery, in which he discusses what national conservatism actually means and why conservatism needs to be rediscovered. In this book, he is explaining many areas where we have misunderstood conservatism, why conservatism is not the same as libertarianism, and what it could mean for families, states, and nations to rediscover conservatism. Dr. Hazony,
let me start right in, if it's okay with you. I would like to begin a little bit with a broader overview over your work, and then kind of dive a little bit more into the details of your most recent works, because I think it's really the collection of your thoughts over the last couple of years that makes all the difference. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of your writing was informed by your work on biblical scripture, on Hebrew scripture, that kind of then also culminated and influenced your thinking about political theory and political philosophy, leading to your one of your recent books, The Virtue of Nationalism, and now also the rediscovery of conservatism. And I think one of the arguments you make, you are, and this is something that's very important for me to talk about at the beginning, you are actually a pluralist. Right? This is something you say at the beginning of your most recent book about conservatism and rediscovery, right? Which is when you talk, for example, about Anglo-American conservatism, right? You say there is not one size fits all conservatism, but that because tradition is something very important, right? This might be different for different societies, for different cultures. So maybe could you elaborate a little bit on this idea that conservatism is not this one-size-fits-all approach, but this might be something that is bound by certain horizons?
Sure. Well, we can probably best to begin that with an important question about the Bible. The Hebrew Bible is the Jewish Bible presents a law and a worldview that is supposed to be for all nations. And it's clear the prophets repeatedly call upon the nations to come to Jerusalem and study God's Torah. But at the same time, it's also explicit in the law of Moses that Israel is not supposed to conquer the neighbors and try to force them to observe God's law. The God of the Hebrew Bible is the first, as far as we know, the first God in human history who gives his own nation borders rather than telling them to go out and conquer the four corners of the earth. And this question, how is it that Moses, who speaks to God, creator of heaven and earth, is given borders and is told that he's not allowed to cross those borders and trouble the neighbors, because each of the neighbors has their own land and their own traditions, their own way to God. So that, if you like, some people would see that as a contradiction. I don't see it as a contradiction, but rather as a very realistic view of what it is that human beings can know, whether it's through philosophy or science or religion. Human beings are limited in what they can know. And even Moses, the greatest of the prophets, is described as being quite limited in what it is that he can know. And so the idea of allowing the world to be divided among many nations and permitting each to pursue its own course to God is central to the Jewish religion, and inherited by Christianity by way of the Old Testament. And that doesn't, as I talk about this in my new book, that is not intended to mean that there's no such thing as truth and that you can't improve your understanding and improve your knowledge and improve your approach to God. But at the same time, none of us is wise enough to be able to dictate for the people of Afghanistan or the Philippines what exactly their way of life should be.
I mean, one of the things that you also mentioned in your book, The Virtue of Nationalism, which, by the way, I still found was a very courageous title, especially given the debate around this topic. I know that Stephen B. Smith has also written a book around the same time in defense of patriotism. So there was a little bit of a movement kind of to be more open about the idea of a national identity. But I think you did not pull any punches. You went right into it, right, and talked about the virtue of nationalism. And one thing that I find so important is you define it like very nicely and very clearly in that book. And I think this is something that very often leads to misunderstandings these days, because in the mind of many public commentators, right, they have this very short distance. They hear nationalism, but very often they tend to think racism. And I think it's very important to make very clear that these are two completely different phenomena, and that nationalism, of course, is in many ways, it's built on a shared tradition, on a shared culture, but it's something, it's an emotional bond, but not a genetic bond or a racial bond. I mean, maybe in one or two sentences, could you define what you mean when you talk about the nation, about nationalism? Because I think so many people, particularly those who haven't read your works, misunderstand it, and maybe often deliberately misunderstand it.
Well, nationalism is a principled stand that argues that regards the world as governed best when many nations are allowed their independence, are allowed to chart their own course according to their own interests and their own traditions. And this is a traditional definition of nationalism. I think people who are familiar with the history of nationalism will immediately recognize it. The reason for the negative view of the word, well, you know, the word nationalism is seen negatively by the same people who also see the Bible negatively, and they see Christianity and Judaism negatively, and they see conservatism negatively, and they see tradition negatively. So it shouldn't surprise us very much that they don't like the word nationalism either. But in particular, the word nationalism suffers from the fact that Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf uses the word nationalism to describe his theory of biological imperialism, his theory that the German race should rule the world, that should be the master of the globe and lord of the earth. And if you read it, not that I recommend that you read it, but if you do read it, you'll see that Hitler detests nations. He detests national states, and he detests national independence. In other words, he detests traditional nationalism of any and every kind, and sees it as a result of British and French weakness, that anybody should talk about the independence of nations. For him, the goal is to conquer the earth. And since I'm not that interested in learning political theory from Hitler, I'm not obligated to use the term the way he uses it. I use it instead the way that I learned to use it in my father's house and among my people.
I mean, isn't it something that we can observe in many of these new ideologies that emerged in the 20th century, that they were not just fundamentally anti-conservative, but anti anti-traditional, exactly as you say, right? They very often perceive themselves as being revolutionary movements, kind of, which automatically detach them in many ways from a worldview that's based on that values tradition, right? It was always the idea it breaks with the past, like kind of like the Revolution and the French Revolution, right? In many ways, you described this also quite nicely, that many of the main figures in the American Revolution were conservative figures, which I think would not apply to many of the key figures in the French Revolution, which deliberately wanted to break with the past, that wanted to create something new, kind of the conditions to create the new perfect society, the new man. And I think this is something we saw also in many of the first half of the 20th century, in Bolshevism, in fascism. But do you think this is also something we increasingly see in some of the modern movements? I tried to kind of flesh a little bit out against whom a new discovered conservatism would be up against, or kind of who are the competitors in the realm of ideas?
Well, everything you say is true. I would go back a little bit further. The hostility to religion is an Enlightenment rationalist hostility. We inherited in the first instance from Descartes, who begins his philosophy by by arguing that the things that we've inherited from the past are worthless, and that his metaphor is that it's better if you have an old building to raze it to the ground, to raze it to the ground and build the building from scratch according to rational principles, rather than simply continuing to add on room after room and adjust the old structure. That view of knowledge, which we call rationalism, the view that claims that experience and historical experience and accumulated experience are not important for reaching the truth. That's a Cartesian axiom, which is then inherited in political thought by Enlightenment rationalist political thinkers, by Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau in The Social Contract, Spinoza, Kant, and then a whole host of others over the centuries. That view is a view which dismisses the idea that our traditions are worth something. That, in fact, I think that by the time you get to Kant, the idea of tradition is seen as simply an obstacle to proper moral and political reasoning, and that is the source of what you're correctly describing. That the 20th century movements are rationalist movements. They're all movements that want to do away with the traditions that have been inherited. Thomas Jefferson is an excellent example. Alone among the American founding fathers, Jefferson was an anti-traditionalist explicitly. His famous view is that every generation should regard itself as though it were an independent country, an independent nation, independent from all the generations that came in the past, as though it were a foreign nation. And as we can see, when you apply that theory that your parents' generation is a foreign country and your grandparents' generation is another foreign country, it turns out that you can't get very far in assembling something worthwhile and healthy and useful, but you can destroy virtually everything.
One could say it probably turns into outright hostility against the past, against traditions, because they're always seen as an anchor around your neck, right, that holds you back from what your true potential might be. And we are then the enlightened generation that sees the world as it is compared to those who came before us. So it's almost, do you think that that enlightenment almost has built into it as a precondition that you have to disconnect yourself from the past, because only then you can come to kind of true moral and then, of course, also scientific enlightenment, where you then can create these large blueprints according to which you can build perfect societies?
Well, let me just be careful about the use of the word enlightenment. I've been speaking about the Enlightenment rationalist tradition, which is a particular tradition. Intellectual historians also, I think mistakenly, but they frequently refer to the opposite tradition, the Anglo-Scottish tradition in philosophy and science. That's also sometimes referred to as enlightenment. You hear about the Scottish Enlightenment or the Anglo-Scottish Enlightenment. The principles of the English and the Scottish thinkers are very different. The English philosophy, for the most part, arises out of a common law tradition, which is empiricist. It regards trial and error through history as being the best way, or maybe the only way, to attain knowledge. And the Scottish school also, to some degree, you see that it builds upon these English ideas. So, sorry, excuse me. So I would just want to be careful. I do think that the mainstream of the Enlightenment is rationalist and revolutionary and unwilling to accept the past as contributing anything. But we should be careful when we're talking about Anglo-Scottish thinkers. It's not quite so simple in that case.
I mean, maybe we can remain with this topic for one more second, because you also talk in your book about Enlightenment liberalism. Can you maybe describe in a few words what you mean by this very specific phenomenon of Enlightenment liberalism?
Sure. Liberalism. Look, liberalism is a political theory that grows out of Enlightenment rationalism. Enlightenment rationalism can refer to different things. It can refer to, it can refer to a theory of knowledge. It can refer to a theory of religion. It can refer to all sorts of things. So one of the things that Enlightenment rationalists did is they created a political doctrine which today is called liberalism. In those days, it didn't have that name, but the view is familiar. Enlightenment liberalism is it's a rationalist doctrine that's based on a number of very familiar principles. First of all, that human beings are perfectly free and perfectly equal to one another by nature. Second, that political obligation arises only in the context of the free and equal individual consenting to have a political obligation or a moral obligation. According to Enlightenment rationalists, that's the source of obligation, morally and politically, is in consent. And if you don't consent, then you're not obligated. And finally, we should add that Enlightenment liberalism also is based on a theory of reason, which argues that all healthy human beings are equipped with what we can call universal reason. Everybody reasons in the same way. Everybody can move from agreed upon self-evident premises through infallible deductions to unassailable conclusions. In other words, if you're reasoning, if you free yourself from tradition and from the experience of the past, and you are reasoning properly, then every human being on earth at every time in history will come to the same basic liberal conclusions about what the just political order is, what the one right political order is. So that's what I refer to in the book as Enlightenment liberalism. In recent years in the universities, liberal thinkers have been discovering lots of problems with Enlightenment liberalism, so they've been moving away from it. But at the same time, I think that if we talk about the public sphere, Enlightenment liberalism continues to be a very powerful force, although the hegemony of liberal ideas, I think, has come to an end in the last couple of years. Nevertheless, Enlightenment liberalism remains the most familiar political theory in the West.
I mean, that is a little bit along, I don't want to simplify, but this is a little bit along, of course, also the lines that Francis Fukuyama made in his End of History thesis, right? That maybe there was an idea of a specific political system, let's call it liberal democracy, that emerged in the West, but that rests on these kind of universal principles that you described, and therefore, hypothetically, would be a system that would function everywhere, right? I think this was a little bit the idea, kind of that we reach an ideological end of history in the form of liberal democracy, because as you just described, because there is this universal kind of reasoning, there is this idea that if we would be completely freed from our traditions, we would approach questions of morality, questions of values all the same. And I think this is a little bit what you go against, but you also, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I think you also go a little bit against kind of some of the basic idea of somebody like John Locke, for example, who in certain conservative circles kind of still seems to be quite popular, especially when you say, well, consent might not be enough, which is, by the way, a view I very much share. I could kind of say that consent alone as a source of value might not be enough. And I know you had some discussions about this in the past, but maybe you could describe in a few sentences your take on John Locke and where you agree and where you disagree with his take.
Well, John Locke is the principal figure who the British and the Americans think of when they think of liberalism. In Europe, maybe there's a tendency in France to think about the social contract of Rousseau, and in Germany, Kant is probably the most important liberal thinker. But as I said before, they all share this view that politics can advance as if it were a mathematical system. So Locke says Locke is the origin of the liberal claim that certain truths are self-evident, and the truths that are self-evident, according to Locke, are the ones that we mentioned: that human beings are free and equal by nature, that they take on obligation by consent, and that reason alone is sufficient if you'll just exercise it to reach all of the correct conclusions about political and moral matters. So that simply is Locke. I don't want to say that it's Locke's entire philosophy, because he is a more complex thinker if you read other works of his. But the most influential work is the Second Treatise of Government, and that's where he lays out this kind of mathematical model that's supposed to give us the universal answer for how all governments become legitimate everywhere and at all times. And because of the fact that this formula of Locke's tells us where governments are legitimate everywhere and at all times, it also tells us which governments are illegitimate. And that's quite simply those governments which are founded on something else, on whether they're founded on long tradition, or whether they're founded on power, on force. Those other kinds of societies that are not founded on consent are considered to be illegitimate. And since the kind of consent that you would have, like the population agreeing, yes, we want this man to be our king, happens almost in no regime throughout human history. What you learn from Locke is that almost every regime in human history is illegitimate and therefore worthy of being destroyed. So it is fundamentally a revolutionary political theory. There's a lot to say about it. I would primarily say that these premises are false, that human beings are not, in fact, perfectly free and perfectly equal anywhere, at any time, in any society, and that moral and political obligation does not only arise from consent. I mean, to take an obvious example, if your country is attacked invaded by a foreign army, it does not make any difference whether you consent or not to going to war. Your obligation to defend your people, your society, your relatives and your countrymen is independent of the question of whether you consent to defend them. And in fact, I would go further and say that the theory of obligation by consent is not really a theory of obligation, because the moment that you withdraw consent, this is an argument that was made, in the 1600s by great conservative thinkers like John Selden and Matthew Hale. They said this is obvious that it can't be consent, because if consent is the source of obligation, then when you cease to consent, when you withdraw your consent, you're no longer obligated. So that's a non-starter. Consent is a theory of freeing yourself from obligation rather than a theory of obligation.
I mean, this is you just said something that I find so interesting, right? So Locke's thought is characterized by this emphasis on consent and freedom. But I think what also was in your argument is it's also ultimately, I assume, a very individualistic form of political philosophy that kind of puts the individual at the center of its worldview. And exactly as you said, right? Because then if I live in a nation that's going to get attacked, would maybe somebody kind of, let's say, who has been marinated in modern thinking that's kind of grounded in Locke, wouldn't there an argument almost become something like, well, is a nation, a society, something worthwhile defending in the first place, if it would include my sacrifice, right? Is in a purely Lockean society, would there be room for the the self-sacrificing soldier, or the kind of that resist even against all odds? Or is this something that would become harder and harder to maintain in an individualistic society? Because if my well-being is the only criteria, and I don't want to put words into Locke's mouth here, but so I'm extrapolating a little bit. But if that's the main criteria, then of course it's very hard for society to ask anything of me that would violate my individual well-being. Just exactly as you said, I give my consent in the social contract because I assume that this social contract will be to my benefit. Now, if all of a sudden they call me to arms to fight and die for my country, I might say this social contract is no longer to my benefit. Therefore, I withdraw my consent, and therefore I'm no longer obliged to fight on behalf of that society. Or am I seeing this a little bit too simple?
Well, I think that is the implication of Locke's theory, but of course the Enlightenment liberalism doesn't stay there. It proceeds to be developed over the centuries in order to try to block that kind of objection. I think since Locke doesn't directly address it, it's probably best to leave Locke alone and just talk in general about Enlightenment liberal theories. What I write in my book is that Enlightenment liberalism is a theory that's been dominant in American Europe beginning after the Second World War, and I would say that the dominion of Enlightenment liberalism, the hegemony, the assumption that Enlightenment liberalism is the necessary and sufficient framework for political life in American Europe, I would say that came to an end 2 years ago, in the year 2020, when all of a sudden, across American Britain, major liberal institutions were overrun and came under the control of a new ideology. We can call it woke neo-Marxism. And this woke neo-Marxism is clearly not Enlightenment liberalism. It's a descendant of it. It's related to it, but it's clearly not liberal. And at this point, I think we've moved to a new stage in the history of Western nations and in the history of democracy, because the unchallenged reign of Enlightenment liberalism has ended, and instead we've moved into a kind of a free-for-all, where on the one hand, the woke neo-Marxists are making their bid to establish a hegemony of their own, and on the other hand, further to the political right, the remnants of the defenders of Enlightenment liberalism are struggling against various other groupings. As you know, my colleagues and I are actively involved in attempting to establish national conservatism, a nationalist conservative worldview that will be strong enough to be able to take on the challenge of the woke neo-Marxists. But there are others. There are other smaller groupings on the right that base their worldview on power and dictatorship, or on attempting to resurrect a political theory based on race, white identitarianism. There's all sorts of things, and in this new environment, we have to think carefully about what kinds of political ideas can be strong enough to allow us to beat back woke neo-Marxism, which is on the verge of victory in many places.
But isn't what you just described? I think this is such a great point when I say kind of how it emerged into neo-Marxism, into wokeism. But sometimes I feel we are still stuck in the late 19th century. And what I mean by this is, like, one of the things that came up in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, right, with Nietzsche, but with others as well, was kind of this idea that modernity has a certain emptiness to it, right? It's a free-for-all. Its values might best be defined by those who who want it the most. It's a matter of will, right? All these different philosophies. But it seems a little bit that this is still around, that one of the key problems at the heart of Enlightenment liberalism or liberalism more broadly is that for everything that it might gives to somebody in the realm of individuality and individualism, it has a very hard time kind of giving meaning, giving values, right? Kind of conveying an idea of virtue. And this is a little bit the conflict that's going on. And I want to connect this with what you just said, and also connect it to another topic, which is, I think we also increasingly see, and you have commented very insightful on this on numerous occasions, there is no such thing as a neutral state, right? Because I feel that this has been a little bit of the post-World War II conservative movement and the alliance with libertarianism, also this idea. So there is a neutral state who kind of just kind of watches over us, that we all can do what we want without interfering with each other. But that's not really the case, right? It turns out that most people apparently want to live in a regime, a worldview regime of some kind. And I think it's only gradually, and you also described this with the National Conservative movement, that you kind of pick up that fight, right? That one of the arguments is there is no such thing as a value neutral state and a value neutral society. So something at some point will dominate. Again, I might be simplifying here a little bit, but so my question is, kind of, do you feel that it is this competition of ideas is still a little bit of a leftover or a kind of a long wave from some of the things we experienced in the West in the late 19th century?
Well, in my new book, Conservatism: A Rediscovery, I outline the assumptions of a political paradigm that I call the conservative paradigm. And this conservative paradigm is based on a very different set of assumptions from liberalism. It assumes, and by the way, I think all of these assumptions are empirically can be empirically validated, and so it assumes things like human beings are born into families and congregations, tribes and nations, and they inherit through these hierarchically structured loyalty groups. They inherit a value system, a language, a way of life, and an understanding of how to judge things to be good or evil, better and worse. Now, people do not necessarily stay within the tribal or national or religious framework that they're raised in. We all know that there's some people who remain loyal to the framework with which they were raised. Other people remain loyal to it, but they push and pull and adjust it in order to try to improve it. And others leave the framework with which they're raised and adopt in adulthood. They adopt another way of life. But the key to understanding the world, I think, is to recognize that when you leave the framework of a certain loyalty group, right, every loyalty group of no matter what scale, whether it's the family or the nation, or even a family of nations, every loyalty group has its explicit or implicit framework that guides people in how to live. And without those guides, people become extremely confused and depressed and find it very difficult to know what their goals should be or what they should do. And so there's been this claim that Enlightenment liberals have made for centuries, the claim that unlike all of the other traditional worldviews, Enlightenment liberalism is absolutely true and it's independent of all worldviews. And that's what gives you what you've been calling the neutral state. And I have an essay against the idea of the neutral state in my previous book on nationalism. And you're right that a conservative looks at the intensely aggressive, active promotion of liberal ideas, and a conservative says these are not universal ideas. uniquely neutral as opposed to the ideas of any other nation or religious group. On the contrary, this is a particular set of ideas that was designed and devised by people in a particular time and place. And noble as the intentions may have been, this liberal worldview has dramatic failings, and you've begun to touch upon these dramatic failings when you say that after a couple of generations, it turns out that a very large number of people who are told from childhood not only that the state is neutral, but that their education is neutral, that their parents should raise them in a neutral way. You know, parents telling their children, "Oh, my beloved son, my beloved daughter, the only thing important in life is that you do whatever makes you happy, and nothing else is important. And don't let your parents or anyone else tell you what to do." This kind of education, in which all alternatives are presented as if they are equal, leads in a very short time, it turns out, within 2 generations, it has led in America and Britain and elsewhere. It has led to an equality of all options, which paralyzes young people. It doesn't free them to become kind of a Nietzschean gay spirit, producing, devising their own way of being, their own philosophy from out of nothing originally. It turns out that almost nobody can do that. Maybe Nietzsche could do it, but nobody else seems to be able to do it. And so you end up with an entire society that's characterized by the kind of despair and immobility and inaction that Jordan Peterson describes when he's talking about, the angry young men of Western societies, or the kind of young women desperately looking for some kind of place and some kind of meaning that Abigail Schreier describes so painfully in her books. These conditions of what Durkheim called anomie, literally living in lawlessness, where there is no direction, there is no meaning. You've been told that you should just make it up for yourself, and it turns out you can't. So what do you do next? I think anybody can understand that these conditions are extremely dangerous, and all you need to do is look at the despair and the loneliness of this kind of individualism once it's applied across an entire society, and once most of the traditions of how that could be guardrails that could direct you are gone. When you look at that, you very quickly come to understand how people can join the woke neo-Marxist movement in order to share a sense of community and camaraderie that's been taken away from them, or how they could gravitate towards some kind of revolutionary fascism, which is much less popular today, but it doesn't mean that it isn't attractive to all sorts of people. And the only answer to this, the only appropriate answer, I think, is a conservative answer, one that says, we see that a life emptied of tradition, emptied of guardrails, emptied of hierarchy that you can respect and be a part of, that kind of a life is a life which is inimical to the health and well-being of human beings. Human beings cannot live this way. And so what we need to do is we need to seek out those places where the healthy traditions of our ancestors still live and are still being handed down. And that is primarily today in Orthodox Christian or Orthodox Jewish congregations, where there continues to be an emphasis, maybe not in all of them, but in most of them, a clear emphasis on a life of conservation and transmission. And that's fundamentally what my new book is about, is that the life of conservation and transmission adopted by individuals and by families and communities.
I think religion does play a very important role in your writing and also in your most recent book. Kind of as an add-on question, it is a very short one. Do you think another area where these conservative values could find support and could find a new flourishing would be within the working class? I sometimes feel that there is a lot of the things you described, right? Wokeism, neo-Marxism, right? It's very pressing, but also it's very pressing because so many members of the, whether it's educational or political, of the elites kind of entrenched in it. But do you think there is within like the lower social levels on the lower levels of the socioeconomic ladder, that most people there still have a pretty good grasp on conservative values or on the value of stable families, on all these values, but that they feel they cannot speak up on behalf of those values because they will be immediately clobbered by whether it's social media, mainstream media, or the elites, right? Nobody wants to come out and then immediately be put into a negative corner, even though they might feel very similarly to what we have been discussing.
Well, look, I don't usually see myself as a class warrior, as a nationalist or a conservative. I think that the different groups within society, that they have different roles, and my aim is to find a way of balancing among the different groups in order to create a strong, healthy society in which the different groups are loyal to one another. So that I just should say as a fundamental thing, that class war is not, in my opinion, a desirable goal. Having said that, the current class structure in America and Europe is it has a very particular form, because beginning in the 1960s, universities in America and Europe began to they opened themselves up to being to students from every part of the population and every location, and they became a kind of vacuum cleaner, sucking in all of the most talented students, regardless of what part of society they came from. And initially, this kind of meritocracy sounds like a very good idea, because it allows for upward mobility. It says that, it doesn't matter if you come from a poor background or a minority background, we'll take you into the highest educational institutions, and you can join the elites. That sounds, on the face of it, noble and good. The problem is that the education, that elite education, which in the 1960s was still a liberal education, has very rapidly, within a short time, transformed itself into a woke neo-Marxist education. Now, there still are liberal professors. In some corners, there's still even conservative professors. But the conservative professors are no longer accepted in academia. If you look at, what happens when a conservative professor retires, he or she is not replaced by another conservative, but rather by some kind of young radical. And so the universities have quickly become a kind of a propaganda mill for indoctrinating the most talented students from every part of society in woke neo-Marxism. And the conditions in which elites come from the universities, you can only get an elite position, in the media or in industry. You can only get an elite position if you graduated from an elite university, and you can't graduate from an elite university without having gone through this brainwash. And the result is that the most aggressive and most radical woke neo-Marxist propagandists are the ones who are graduating from the elite universities, whereas those classes, the weaker classes, which did not succeed in getting their children into into Princeton or into Oxford or whatever it might be, they're the ones who are still can have intuitions that are to a certain degree reflective of the old traditions, the old Christian traditions, the old nationalist traditions. By the way, we see this also in the Jewish community. That the working class maintain a greater common sense than many of the educated Jews do, and but so this is kind of a universal phenomenon that the elites are indoctrinated and they're moving towards something that looks more and more like Bolshevism, and the less educated part of the populace retains a greater attachment to traditions. However, as you say, that doesn't mean that they know enough, remember enough, or are brave enough to be able to maintain the traditions. And that's what leads us to the current crisis. If the working class had its own, intellectual leadership, which was traditionalist and capable of educating and representing their intuitions, then that would be helpful. But that's not really the condition right now. The condition right now is that educational, philosophical, theoretical elites are overwhelmingly radical and hostile to the working classes and to their ideas, to their intuitions. And the project of national conservatism is and of my most recent book as well, the project is to try to give an intellectually sturdy, sound, historically grounded, philosophically helpful view of what tradition is for and how it works, and not only how it can preserve an independent nation over generations, but especially how it can preserve your life personally, how you yourself personally, by becoming a conservative person, by becoming by plugging into a congregation that is still conserving and transmitting the cultural inheritance of past generations, how that can save your life and make your life something that you feel is worthwhile and exciting and meaningful and just and right and worth living.
But as a last point, because I know we're running out of time, but I think you just said something that is so important also regarding the goals of national conservatism, because what you just described, I mean, this is kind of the worst of two worlds. You have potentially an elite that has the economic means to kind of indulge in certain fantasies, kind of to fill, if we want to call it, a spiritual hole in their souls, right? This is kind of what we see with 68 different genders and these kind of things, right? They have the means to do these things because they can afford it. And then you have what for lack of a better term, I describe as the working class, who doesn't have anything philosophically, if you want, to fill that spiritual hole. So this might be one of the reasons why they then turn to desperation, and whether this then expresses itself in drug overdoses and these other areas, right? And I think what you just described is that it's why it's so important not just to have this as an umbrella philosophical discussion, but really also to distill out of it ideas that give guideposts for the individual life. And I think this is something particularly in the later chapters of your most recent book, Conservatism and Rediscovery, is something that you actually try to do.
Yeah, I think I write in the book that, this is probably a little bit funny. I write in the book that you can't learn conservatism from a book. You can't learn conservatism from an entire library of books. So, my arguments in my books, they may be helpful to some people in getting to see the kind of mess that they're in and the kind of mess that we're all in, and the great danger that faces American and European civilization at this moment. I think it could be helpful, but but in the end, living a conservative life, one that can give meaning and fitting direction to individuals and families and ultimately to nations. Leading a conservative life is something that you can't learn from a book. You can only learn it from conservative people. You can only learn it by taking part in a conservative society, which is one where people constantly work at the difficult effort of conserving and transmitting and passing on and elaborating and repairing inherited traditions of ideas, behaviors, and institutions. All of these inherited ideas, traditions, and institutions, ideas, behaviors, and institutions, all of them can be understood only properly from within a context where you have joined into a tradition. You meet people who are older than you are and know more than you do, and you give honor to them. And by honoring them, you open yourself up to learning. And that opening yourself up to learning from a tradition, that is something that, look, anybody, anywhere who is concerned for his or her own well-being, wants to have a family, wants to have a family that doesn't quickly end in divorce, wants to have a family in which the children are capable of learning from the parents. Anybody who wants those kinds of things is going to have to take the step and join a congregation and begin learning again. You can do this at any age. This is not just something young people should do. But people who are young and have no commitments are most easily in a position to just do this. It's hard work, but it's the way to save yourself, and it's ultimately the way to save your country.
Well, Yoram Hazony, thank you so much for your time. I can only recommend your books to my listeners. I will also link to them in the description of this conversation. I'm looking forward to your next projects, and I hope that we can do this again in the future.
Thank you very much, Ralph.
Thank you, Yoram. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye.
God bless you.